So, all of this to say that, and this is a hack attempt at Chinese history, so I really urge your forgiveness as I go through this very quickly. But, the way that a lot of people have thought about it is that China is one of the oldest states in the world. During the Qin Empire, which of course is a small part of contemporary China today, but really includes a lot of the core provinces. The critical thing that struck me is the comparison to India, which I'll get to in a second. But if you look at it in terms of some very classic indicators of what you might consider the presence of a centralized state, the expansion of military service, the decline of patrimonial office holders, and the kind of meritocratic bureaucracy, population registration, and the imposition of a new impersonal hierarchy. I mean, these as a political scientist, I consider key indicators of the degree of centralization of a state. And you see that in China really during the Qin. And the interesting thing here is also the introduction of weights and measures. And Walter Scheidel, who I think has done a quite interesting comparison of the Roman Empire and of China, says, in the 6th century, China's imperial reunification restored the bureaucratic state. So the point I'm making is I don't necessarily think of state history as irreversible, or the establishment of a centralized state as a kind of linear process. I think that there can be important reversals, and there were in China very, very important reversals. But what strikes me from a comparative lens to India is the fact that China reunified at various points in time, and I'll get to the contrast with India. So Walter Scheidel basically calculates that the Chinese core, which he conservatively defines as the region controlled by the Qin, was united for 936 of the past 2,220 years, or 42% at the time. And his contrast with the Roman Empire is that it was 12%. So that gives you some idea of the comparison. In India, in contrast, I think Sunil Khilnani kind of presents this in the idea of India, but he's not alone in suggesting this, is that before the gradual British acquisition, no single imperium had ever ruled the whole immense subcontinental triangle. And as I said, Professor Dwara's book does complicate this a little, and I'll be happy to talk about that. And similarly, so the interesting thing is the contemporary of the Qin in China and India are the Mauryas. And they are very interesting because of the fact that they're perhaps the indigenous empire that controls the largest amount of China, of India, at any point. And I'm so grateful that it wasn't China, but that it controls the most amount of India of any other really state. And we can discuss whether the Mughals are a comparison. But the interesting thing about the Mauryas is, of course, when you compare them to the Qin, they do not standardize weights and measures. They do not attempt to introduce any uniformity into languages. They don't impose anything resembling state institutions on anything but the most core areas of the empire. And the recruitment of the state administration remains completely patrimonial, and this has already been mentioned, and I'll bring up again, sharply limited by the caste system. So again, this is a very hack understanding of Indian history, but as I said, these are ill-thought-out thoughts. And so, Khilnani would argue that there's no concept of a state ever emerged, and unlike the history of Europe, and he's really driven by this comparison with pre-colonial Europe, with pre-colonial India and Europe than with China. But he says that there's no upward curve in the responsibilities of the state. And actually, he's not alone. So, these are a few people, including Stephen Rosen here at the government department at Harvard, who has a book on armies in India. And his basic point about why the Indian army is so weak is essentially because it's a militia force with close links to Indian society, and it's embedded in the caste system. So all of this is to say that a variety of scholars of India have made the point that the strength of society, and in particular the caste system, has weakened the reach and actually the strength of the state historically. Fukuyama kind of summarizes it by saying China's default political mode was a unified empire, while India's was a disunited system of petty political units punctuated by brief periods of unity and empire. So what I want to suggest, and I'll go very quickly over this, is that this is not a relationship that is confined to India and China. So I use here something called a state antiquity index, which I have not constructed, which is available, and I can talk about how it's constructed. Essentially, just measures the existence of a centralized state, and I'll talk about how that is measured. But you can see a kind of upward positive relationship between how long a state has been around and, for instance, here, your expectancy of healthy life years at birth. You can see that there's an inverse relationship with infant mortality measured as before 5 or before 1, a positive relationship with the Human Development Index, and a negative relationship with poverty. And I realize I'm going very quickly over these, so I'd be happy to return to any of these. But all of this is just to say that this relationship between state history and state capacity is one that at a very, very initial level in these scatter plots does seem to hold beyond India and China. And what I've just suggested a relationship between history and capacity, and what I just briefly want to do in the last couple of minutes is talk about what it is that this relation, what is the mechanism by which this might be related. And what I want to suggest really is that it's a type of state-society relations. And again, as I said, this is very, very preliminary, but one idea is that the longer and deeper a society's experience with a centralized state, the more likely it might be to identify with that state. And consequently, perhaps, and this again goes back to some of the themes mentioned in the previous panel, the degree to which society might mobilize for state aims. And the degree to which society will mobilize for state aims is something that has been considered quite critical to state capacity by scholars of state capacity, from Durkheim to Michael Mann to Joel Migdal. And so I argue that actually there might be this kind of relationship that goes from a history of centralized rule all the way to mobilization and state capacity. And just again, in the last minute, and people who study China know this much better than I do, but the role of public health campaigns in China's health achievements has been well documented. And popular mobilization was really key to these public health campaigns, as this quote shows you. And the interesting thing in terms of kind of making the link to societal identification with the state was that these were called patriotic health campaigns and were run by the National Patriotic Health Campaigns Committee. So really this comes from someone who knows very little about China, but was just struck by this when reading about these public health campaigns. In India, in contrast, government reports and memoirs by officers, not only during the colonial period, but also in post-independence India, are replete with references to the absence of popular mobilization. They talk again and again about people not showing up for immunization campaigns, even when the doctor does show up, the fact that people are much more willing to go to societal doctors, kind of informal, you might call them touts, but they really did have a level of legitimacy in local areas, and people are much more willing to go to them. So this has been actually one of the kind of bete noirs of public health campaigners, activists, and officials in India, even in the post-independence period. And just again, in the last 30 seconds, what really strikes me about the Beijing Olympics is, and this the International Olympics Committee in its report says, it highlights the successful coordination of over 500,000 volunteers as a key factor in the indisputable success of the Olympics. And over 1 million people apply to be volunteers, and it's just photographs of the volunteers at the Beijing Olympics. I mean, they're all quite young, as you'll see in this photograph, but then, there's Sun Fangchu, who says, who's 87-year-old, and he's a volunteer, and there's this quote from him in which he says, we've been waiting 7 years. We feel it's really an honor to do something for our country. And in terms of popular participation, I mean, Beijingers' enthusiasm, this is not just taxi drivers and public officials who have to learn English, but people who just want to learn English generally. And what I found really interesting was the positive response to a campaign to curb the bad manners of Beijingers. And I was just struck by how something like this in Delhi was just unbelievable. I mean, I had to read this whole thing a few times, and I was just struck by, the fact that they kind of acknowledged and wanted to self-rectify these 12 aims, including smiling too little and being too talkative, which I would agree is a problem with Delhiites, as being one myself. And, just last 10 seconds less, over 20,000 people apply to be volunteers. This is a headline, just give you one example of many headlines. Half of the volunteers sign up and disappear with their kits, valued at about $320. And this is the story of the Games. So while you can argue that a lot goes wrong with the organization of the Games prior to the actual conduct of the Games, one of the lasting stories of the Commonwealth Games is the volunteers disappearing with their kits and this. Empty stadiums, and I'll leave you with that. No one shows up. There is not only just the fact that the volunteers decide that they don't want to show up after taking their kit, but also the fact that no one in Delhi, leave alone from any part of India, wants to come and attend these games. And despite government appeals repeatedly saying, this is really embarrassing, and these are photographs from The Guardian, The Independent, The New York Times, and of course every Indian newspaper. So I'm sorry for taking that long.
Thank you very much. It's turned out to be far more macro than I had anticipated, with the whole sweep of Chinese and Indian history. for which we are very grateful. And